You're looking for me.
You know, I don't know if I should be alarmed at just how much serial killer movies and TV shows excite me. I think I've watched just about every shred of content in this genre, right from the glory days of serial killing flicks like Silence of the Lambs to modern day hits like Dexter or Mindhunter. If you ask me about my absolute favorites, I would definitely have the iconic Se7en on my list. The movie that left me in a state of shock. This movie, starring Brad Pitt, Morgan Freeman, and Kevin Spacey, told the story of a deranged psychopath, John Doe, who picked his victims based on the 7 deadly sins. If you watched the movie, you surely remember the climactic twist, and the movie's become a cult classic in the genre. Over a decade later, there came some interesting developments when Zenescope Entertainment came up with a comic book based on the 1995 film. Only this time you really get a look into the twisted psyche of the killer. The movie told the story from the perspective of 2 homicide detectives, Somerset and Mills. But in the comic series, we get the version of the killer, John Doe, who's using the 7 deadly sins to prove a point about the world. I've always been intrigued by the psychological malfunctions of serial killers, and this comic series was an enlightening read for me that gave me more context and a better perspective on the events of the film. In this video, I'll take you through the horrifying journey of the killer as I break down the events of this 7-issue comic series. Remember how the movie explores the victims chosen by John Doe? In his mind, the killer is punishing sinners who embody gluttony, greed, sloth, lust, pride, envy, and wrath, and he uses the murders to teach a lesson about societal decay. In the comic series, we not only get to witness what's going on in his mind all this while, but also the backstory and childhood trauma that turned him into the man that he becomes. I've never heard of a serial killer who didn't have a traumatic event triggering the killing spree, and John Doe is no exception. What I love the most about this comic series is how it also features pages from the killer's journal, where he elaborates more on his entire thought process. The first issue opens with gluttony, and this is a throwback to the morbidly obese victim that the detectives encounter in the movie. John goes on a rant about the societal condition, where he sees a vagrant sitting by the subway, and he remarks how everyone seems to have forgotten about the less fortunate. He believes that the world does not take notice unless the world is made to, and so I come to terms with the real motivation behind his killings. There is far too much sin in the world, and John has taken it upon himself to make them all remember and bring them out of the dark. Now, the scene shifts back to the morbidly obese man pleading for help. He begs to be freed and asks why John is doing such unspeakable things to him. But John simply explains that he sinned, the sin of gluttony. The man promises John everything from money to secrecy about his identity, but of course, the psychopath is not going to be moved by all that. He simply forces plates of food for the glutton to eat. There's a chilling sequence where we get a glimpse of John's journal, where he has a particular verse from the Bible about gluttony. The thing with this comic series is that there are no surprises as such, because the ones who have watched the movie already know what's coming. It's just the way the context is given that makes me admire the narrative so much. For instance, the comic series shows a backstory of the glutton, where he started to eat his way through grief. It started with the death of his mother when he was only a child, and she died from kidney failure caused by diabetes. This was followed by the death of his father a year later, and he died from a blood vessel rupture in his brain. These deaths surely came from unhealthy life choices, but the man still grew up to develop a habit of unhealthy eating. He probably gave up on life, but he soon realized that no matter how much he ate, his life was not going to end willingly. But by now, it was too late to change his lifestyle, and he continued eating till he became so morbidly obese that even moving around was a tricky chore. I'm jolted back to the current situation, when John wakes him up and forces him to eat even more, though he clearly cannot. He force feeds him pizza and more food, even after the man pukes, and finally, it all ends when he dies. The first issue ends with the cops on the scene, visibly shocked by the ghastly remains of the man lying dead. They summon the homicide detectives, which is a tie-in with the movie where the detectives first come across the unusual case. With this begins the terrifying saga of John, as he writes in his journal, "Today I killed a man. I looked upon my works and saw it was good." Next up is the case of the lawyer, Eli Gould, and this is John's second victim. the one charged with greed. I love how the issue starts off with a verse from the Bible condemning greed, and then we move on to the curious case of Eli Gould, who makes millions of dollars each year. However, his methods are questionable because he fights the cases of murderers, rapists, and drug dealers so that they can go free. He reaps the rewards, and he has clearly surrendered his conscience a long time ago. But John's already after this man, and he realizes that the scales of justice have become unbalanced and weakened by the greed of Eli Gould. Payment is due, and John is preparing for the worst possible punishment. The story shows how Eli Gould only works for the super rich, working through loopholes in the system to get them a reprieve in court. There's an example of a rape victim being overlooked because Eli works for the father of the accused, who happens to be a wealthy old man. This is followed by his successful defense of a man who is a known murderer and drug trafficker. Next thing you know, Eli Gould wakes up in his underwear, tied to a chair, as John holds him at gunpoint. He tells the shocked lawyer about how defending those whose hearts are unclean makes him as guilty as them. And there's a page in John's journal that reads, 1 pound of flesh, no more, no less. No cartilage, no bone, but only flesh. This task done, and he would go free. The flashback shows how John has been following the trail of Eli Gould for some time now. He watched him evict a helpless woman and her kids from their house, and he even visited Eli's office to seek his help as an innocent who had been framed. Of course, he didn't have the money to afford his services, and Eli just rejected his pleas. Back in the present, he reminds Eli of how terrible he's been, and even though the terrified lawyer is willing to make amends, there is no time for redemption now. Then comes the most shocking part of the whole act, as John reminds Eli of the Merchant of Venice, and he has the same cruel idea of justice, where he wants a pound of flesh cut off from Eli's body. He's forced to cut himself with a knife, and there's a crazy amount of bleeding from such a serious wound. He dies bleeding, and I'm reminded of how the detectives found him in the movie, the victim of greed. As for John, he's only getting started, because more victims remain to be hunted as his twisted version of justice has to be completed. When I think back on the Se7en comic series, I realize that the sloth victim is the least eventful kill in the whole story. In the movie, we saw the sloth victim as Theodore Victor Allen, who was a drug dealer, and he grew up with abusive parents, which caused a variety of mental illnesses in his life. He became a drug dealer and was arrested several times for the crimes he committed, which included the assault and attempted rape of a minor. Clearly, he was a despicable man, and the comic book narrative sheds more light on the nature of his capture and torture at the hands of John. He does it meticulously, posing as a friend and drugging him enough to have him immobilized. If you remember the movie events, this victim was discovered by the cops after a year of his kidnapping, and all this while, John had put him through absolute hell. He strapped him to a bed and inflicted countless injuries on him, including severing his hand, and he also made sure that he survived to experience the unbearable pain. The police also found Polaroid photos showing Victor's worsening condition, and he was the only victim who was found alive even though the hospital diagnosed him as brain dead. The comic book narrative focuses more on John's thinking process and how he saw himself as the sword of God, delivering swift justice to a man so sinful. Sloth is generally defined as a spiritual and emotional apathy, and whatever we see of Victor in the comics only confirms the same about him. The chemically induced coma was John's way of highlighting the evils of such existential laziness, and he writes pages in his journal accounting his views, which are highly religious and extremist. The fourth issue, where John deals with the lust victim, is probably the most insightful among all, because this is the one where we get a hang of his psyche and what really drives him. Through the story, flashbacks show glimpses of his childhood and upbringing, and it's not difficult to connect the dots and understand what makes him such a relentless killer, where he kills in the name of justice and acts as the hand of God. He starts off by visiting a strip club, and he thinks about this particular story from the Bible. When God made his plans known to Abraham about the destruction of Sodom, Abraham was worried about the righteous people who might live in the city. God then promised that he would save the city if he found only 10 such men. Now John is acting as God, and he claims to be carrying the same weight as Abraham, trying to find some good in a mob of sinners. Suddenly, one of the ladies at the strip club call out to him, and the narrative heads to a flashback into John's childhood. I wasn't really surprised to find out that John went to a very conservative Christian school. He was punished by the teacher for merely looking at one of his classmates named Mary, and the teacher, who was a nun, humiliated him in front of the whole class. It was stemmed in his mind that lust is a deadly sin, and forbidden. It was the same for him back home, where his mother disciplined him with an iron fist. Even talking to a girl was frowned upon, and she warned him about the McFadden girl next door. Apparently, the way she dresses in short clothes and the way her parents allow her to dress are not very God-fearing or right, according to John's mother. She then tells him about Uncle Tim, who is coming for the weekend. And no, I'm not mentioning this as a random event, which you'll understand soon enough. Back to the present, John is disgusted by the girl at the strip club offering him a dance. He heads out to puke, so strong is the feeling of hate. Then he remembers his childhood once again, where he was caught looking out of his window, staring at the McFadden girl changing in a room across the street. Unfortunately for John, his mother caught him in the act, and the punishment was severe. Even his uncle gives him a hard time and sends him to a Bible study class. On his way there, he's confronted by the McFadden girl, who ridicules him for his mother's strict ways. When John tries to reason with her, she gives him a piece of her mind and suggests about an illicit relationship between his mother and his uncle. John is shocked and petrified, but he runs home and peeks from the window, only to confirm his worst fears. The one claiming such a moral high ground and giving him such severe punishments is actually getting it on with his uncle. This only worsens his condition, and he develops some kind of mental block about women in general. The next thing you know, the McFadden girl is lying dead, bloodied in her genital region, suggesting a serious assault and battery. It's not shown clearly if John was the one behind the attack, but I would think he is the one responsible. Now, in the present day, John wonders as an adult how humanity has forgotten the example from the Bible, and the fire and brimstone that destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah no longer resonates. Of course, he takes it upon himself, like everything else, and he heads to a leather shop with a sketch of some creepy torture tool that even surprises the store owner. But he wants it built irrespective of the price, and we all know how that turns out, don't we? This is actually the lethal strap-on device that John makes a man wear at gunpoint as he forces him to go up against a sex worker. For me, this was one of the most disturbing deaths of all the seven, and I don't really mind that the comic book doesn't really paint a grotesque picture of this and lets it happen off-panel. The fifth issue, about the Pride victim, opens with the disturbing image of a woman in her lingerie as she lies dead on her bed, clearly mutilated. Pride has been described by John as the sin from which all others arise, and this is what ignited the fall of Lucifer from heaven. John writes in his journal that even though the consequence is so obvious, still the lesson is yet to be learned by many. This is his turn to impart some biblical justice, and he chooses a fashion model as his target. We see her busy in a fashion shoot, barely clad and proudly embracing her body. She is a confident young model, but not the most compassionate one, which is soon clear from the way she treats her young daughter or those working for her. She's extremely rude, self-obsessed, and arrogant, basically all the things that you might expect from a very proud individual. Parallel to her story, we get another flashback of young John in his school, when he could not help but express his pride once. It happened when a teacher tried to humiliate him during Bible study class, and he turned it back on her by narrating the entire verse confidently to shut her down. One of his classmates named Katie, who's also a cheerleader, is quite impressed by his brilliance and doesn't mind a private study session with him. John is guarded and shy, but he doesn't refuse her outright. It's also revealed that John had started to keep a journal as a child, and when he came back home from school that day, he prayed to God for forgiveness for showing such arrogance and pride in class. He also becomes more observant about his mother's double standards, which leads to more violence and chaos at home, and I slowly start to understand the undoing of his psyche bit by bit. Back in the present, John interacts with a model at a party, and he approaches her posing as a confident photographer from the West Coast. He invites her for a photo shoot that very night, and she doesn't seem to mind, and, well, we can all anticipate what's coming for her. The narrative's interrupted by another flashback, where John takes Katie home to study with her, and things go horribly wrong when his mother sees them. She beats him bloody and humiliates him in front of the girl, and I do get the feeling that John had started to develop a mild crush on Katie. We see the impact in the present timeline, where John lures the model to her place on the pretext of creating a solid album for her. But he doesn't take much time in getting straight into the act. He injects her with something that soon knocks her out, and he condemns her life choices and way of living. The next stage of the punishment is brutal and bloody, as he chops off her nose and he leaves her like that without killing her. Of course, she does it herself because she can't bear to see herself as the mutilated version of her pretty former self. The next stage connects to the movie, where the detectives are summoned, but it's already too late. Now we're building up to the final stages, and this is where the movie delivered the ultimate shocker, in the form of his final two victims, envy and wrath. The sixth issue is all about envy, and it starts off with a page from John's journal, where he claims to have a clarity in his thoughts because of his certain death. He knows he will be dead soon, but that's only widened his purpose. It also marks the first day that he cuts off each of his fingerprints, and he says he will be doing that for the rest of his life. This is basically his confession account, and he admits that cutting off his fingerprints is an act of sacrifice. There are some grim warnings for those who will find this piece of document, such as when he reminds everyone that the more John is studied, the more people will find the true ugliness and horror of themselves. He even writes to Somerset and Mills, the two detectives who are after him, and he only has admiration for them for doing their work dutifully. He also spies on the detectives, and Mills catches his fancy. He takes a liking to his life and his loving wife, and John starts to envy this whole wholesome life. He remarks how Mills has everything that he once had, and how he wishes to have them again. Thus, he sins by envying the life of Mills, and this makes him the sixth victim himself. He visits Mrs. Mills posing as Detective John, who works with her husband. She opens the door to him without suspecting a thing, and she even locks up her dogs. Well, if you don't know the rest, here comes a major spoiler. He decapitates her and takes the head in a box, while arranging the box to be delivered to a particular location. Now, I'm glad the comic book skips the gory details and you don't really see the beheading, just like in the movie, but the implications are still no less terrifying. And finally, we're into the last victim, the one of wrath. The final act begins as John goes and surrenders. He is taken in and he lays out his conditions before his lawyer. The detectives must take him to an undisclosed location, or else he will plead insanity in court to get relief from the charges against him. Then begins the reluctant journey, and we get the final fate of John's cursed life, where his mother single-handedly turned him into a monster. She set herself on fire and killed herself after destroying all his childhood memories and journals. Back in the present, it's about to be over soon. Mills gets to see the box that's delivered to him just as planned, and inside the box, he finds the head of his wife. To rile him up further, John tells him about how his wife was pregnant, and she pleaded with him to spare her life and that of the unborn child. He asks Mills to become vengeance, and by now, Mills has had enough. He shoots him dead, and he becomes the final victim of wrath. The comic series ends with a note from John for Somerset, which reads, "Greetings, Detective Somerset. I trust you'll appreciate our time together. John Doe." I've never read a comic book that adds so much perspective to a story that I already know from a movie. Se7en is a classic in its own right, but the comic series completes the saga because it always helps you when you know the exact motivations driving the serial killer. The narrative is dark and thorough, and even without some of the kills that take place off-panel, there's a serious tone that never lets you relax. You can think of it as reading a psychological thriller, where you get the explanatory notes of what makes the killer kill. The childhood story, the terrible parenting that he received, and the regressive upbringing all combined together to create a twisted version of justice. I don't think John even knew what it meant to be a normal human anymore, and there's no reasoning with someone who has abandoned rationality against some twisted sense of biblical verses. I would strongly recommend this comic series because you really need to go through the pages of his journal, his morbid little sketches, and the glimpses of his terrible past. Let me know in the comments below what you think of this comic series, and also share your thoughts on this unusual serial killer, John Doe, who thinks he's God's own angel serving up justice as he deems fit.